Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break, maybe had some cake, some cool drink, and you're ready to go. Let's have a look where we are now with the human nervous system. We have done the peripheral and the autonomic nervous system. Today we have done the nerve cells. Now we're going to do the reflex arc and illnesses. Let's continue. So before we get to reflex arc, you need to know an important concept, which is synapses. Right. That is the point where the impulse passes from the terminal branch of the axon to the neuron, from the one neuron to the dendrite of the next neuron. So if you have a look at this picture here, you will see that's the axon, right? And there's little vesicles, and in those vesicles there are chemicals we call neurotransmitters, right? So what happens is those vesicles move to the end of the axon's terminal, right? And it bursts open, releasing these chemicals, and these chemicals move to the dendrite of the next neuron, right? It makes a little vesicle again and it moves on, right? So that is how basically a nerve impulse will be transmitted from one neuron to the next over a synaptic gap. We call this a synaptic gap, right? It's a gap. And the neurons will never touch each other. They will never ever touch each other. So why is this important? The synapse will ensure that the impulse travels in one direction. So these chemicals won't go there and all over the show. It will go in one direction. Right, one direction only. And the synapse of a nerve impulse can either be speeded up or slowed down or blocked. So that means basically when you drink alcohol, the alcohol will slow down these chemicals here. And the chemicals will start swimming here and swimming here and swimming there. That's why your reaction time when you're drinking is so much slower. That's why you shouldn't be driving when you're drinking. But other drugs will also have the same effect. I'm not a doctor, so I can't tell you what drugs, but they have an effect on your neurotransmitters, which will make you slower or maybe faster. Right, now we're getting to the next part of the human nervous system, namely the reflex action. This is a very important part of the syllabus, or they love to ask it. So you need to know this definition. Reflex action is a quick, automatic response to a stimulus. This is when you put your finger against something that burns. You don't know it's hot, maybe. You're a bit slow, you're a bit stupid or something. Right. And before you even see that your finger's on this hot plate, your nervous system already reacted and pulled away your hand, right, to save your poor finger. That is a reflex action. Very quick, very fast to save you. And the impulse never goes through the brain. It immediately goes through the spinal cord back to your finger. So you don't even realize this is going on while it's going on. So let's have a look at this situation here. You can see the flame of the candle there, that's the stimulus. That will now stimulate the receptors in your skin there, and that will send an impulse along your arm to the central nervous system. Can you see that this is the spinal cord? Right, not the brain, it's not going to the brain. So immediately interneuron is there, the impulse is moving there, and then through the motor neuron ends up in the effector. Effector is the one that is now doing affecting the change or reacting to the situation. So this muscle will now contract and pull this hand away from the candle without you ever even knowing. After that, the signal will also go to the brain, but your brain is a bit further up, and you will feel ouch and you will feel stupid maybe. Right, so reflex action, like I said, is quick, automatic, you don't control this, respond to stimulus. And it allows for a quick response without thinking, because if you had to think about it, your finger would have been burnt to a pulp, right? And examples of this is a knee jerk. When you go to the doctor, they will usually have a little hammer and hit you on the leg. He's not like in pain and stuff. You just want to see if your reflex actions are still okay. Sneezing when something flies into your nose, coughing when something goes down the wrong pipe and your body needs to protect you. Or blinking, right, when something flies towards your eye and you need to blink quickly to get that mosquito out of there. Right, so this is all part of reflex actions. But now you must know the difference between a reflex action and a reflex arc. Arc is the pathway along an impulse is transmitted to bring about a quick response. So this is basically the road or the path that these impulses are taking, right? That's the difference. The action is the actual action, the quick automatic action. The arc is the pathway along which the impulse is transmitted to bring about a quick response. The nervous impulse goes to the spinal cord, like I said, then passes from the spinal cord directly, doesn't go to the brain, to the effector. The effector is the muscle or the gland that needs to now affect immediate response, or else you'll burn your finger. Let's look at an actual diagram of a reflex arc. Firstly, we'll start with the sensory cells. Right, this will be in your finger or in your skin, and this will now get the stimulus from the flame or whatever is now causing the problems, right? And they are called the receptors, right? Receptors. And they will convert the stimulus, and you need to use these words, stimulus, to an impulse, right? So that impulse is now moving along the sensory neuron, you can see here, into the spinal nerve. And remember, I showed you a picture of the spinal nerve, and it's having this little roots. So the dorsal root will be the one at the back, right? So the sensory neuron is always in your dorsal root. And can you see there's a little bubble there? Remember, we call this bubble the ganglion from the central nervous system. We did that in the central nervous system. This is where your cell body is found, the cell body of your sensory neuron. So when you see the little bubble, the little ganglion, you always know that this is the dorsal root and that's your sensory neuron. So the impulse is now carried all the way here, and you will see that this part here is the gray matter, the butterfly or the H, right? And remember this, the other part is called the white matter, right? So what happens with the impulse, it is now moving across a synaptic gap. There is a synaptic gap between the sensory neuron and the interneuron, right? So the impulse will move across that synaptic gap to the interneuron. This is the interneuron there. And remember, interneuron we always find in the spinal cord, nowhere else. So this is your interneuron. The impulse will be moving right down towards the motor neuron. There will once again be a synaptic gap. Talk about the synaptic gap when you answer a question on this. So it will move across that synaptic gap to the motor neuron. Now the motor neuron will now transmit this impulse in the ventral root. Ventral is the front, right? Ventral root towards the muscle or the effector. Remember, the effector is the one that's affecting the change. Now this muscle will now contract and it will move the finger away from that flame. Right, so that is a short, or not a short, but a diagram of showing how a reflex arc works. So remember, the important parts is the receptors, the stimulus converted to an impulse. Impulse moving along this sensory neuron. You have to know the sensory neuron, the dorsal root. Then you have to go to the spinal cord, the interneuron, and remember your synaptic gaps here, right? So the impulse will move across those synaptic gaps again, interneuron to the motor neuron, through the ventral root here to the effector. That's also a very important part if you answer this question in an exam paper. Let's move on. Let's look at some questions that I've asked in the past. Give only the letter of the part that represents the effector. Remember, effector is that the one that must pull away or affect the change. And if you look at that picture there, you will see that that's muscle. And the muscle is E. Right. Interneuron. That can only be in the gray part of your spinal cord. Right. And that will be A. Next question, sensory neuron. Remember the bubble. You have to look at the bubble, dorsal root. So that will be number C, not B, because B is pointing at the bubble. C is actually the neuron there. So it would be C. Like I said, C. Okay, let's move on. Give the letter and the name, two things. So you have to give two things here. Of the neuron in a diagram that is probably damaged, right? If a person is able to detect the stimulus but cannot respond. So now you have to think. If you can detect it, it means that the neuron from your senses, your sensory neuron, is still working. but you're not reacting, you're not doing anything. That means that your motor neuron is not working. So F, the motor neuron, will not be working. You have to give both because they're asking for 2. Right, state if the nerve impulse travels from D to E or from E to D. Now if you look, there's D, right, so it's all the way around here to E, or from the muscle to the flame. No, it's definitely from D to E. Right, so now we're going to move on to the next part of the nervous system, and that is illnesses or disorders of the nervous system. But before we can do that, we must look at some keywords. The first one is autoimmune disease. That is a disease that's caused by your own immune system, right? Your immune system starts attacking healthy tissues, right? So that's the first one. Dementia is a decline in memory and reasoning. And progressive illness is an illness that gets worse and leads to death. So it cannot be helped. This one, there's no cure for this one. You're basically going to get worse and worse and worse until you die. Right, now the first one we're looking at is the Alzheimer's disease. Right, this is the most common form of dementia. If you look at the infographic here on the side, you will see Alzheimer's is a specific brain disease that accounts to 60 to 80% of dementia cases. But if you look at dementia, it's a general term for symptoms like decline in memory, reasoning, and other thinking skills. So dementia is the overall condition, but Alzheimer's is one of the illnesses that causes dementia, right? And it usually affects people over 65, but unfortunately some people will get it early on, right? And this is a horrible illness because if you look at these pictures of the brain, this is a healthy brain. Can you see there? Lots of tissue there. But now look at the Alzheimer's brain. Look at those holes that is there. So the neurons and the synapses basically disappear. That's what a loss of neurons and synapses in your brain. So that's why they can't think, remember, and so on. There's absolutely no cure. It leads to death, and they don't know what causes it. It's just something that happens. Right. And what is the symptoms of it? Slower thinking, behavioral changes. They actually say people get more, they get conflict and aggressive, confused, they don't know where they are, what's the time, the place. They don't recognize their own family, people that they used to know. They have difficulty in speaking, swallowing, and walking. So this is really a terrible illness. The next one is multiple sclerosis, right, MS. This is also progressive. Degenerative means breaking down of the central nervous system. Diagnosis is usually between the ages of 20 and 40 when they diagnose you with this illness, and it affects more women than men. Right, so this is an autoimmune disease, and it means many scars. At MS, can you see that the myelin sheath there is damaged, right? So that's causing scars. And that is why it makes it impossible for the impulse to move along. It affects movement, feeling, balance, tingling and numbness, muscle weakness, fatigue, bladder and bowel problems, pain, concentration and memory loss, mood swings, and there's unfortunately no cure for this illness. So this brings me to the end of our section today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot, and I will hopefully see you next time when I do the eye.